Hello, and welcome back to another week. This week we're talking about communication in families, something that all of us have experience in, I'm sure. Some of us better than others, perhaps. But we all know what communication in families can be like, so hopefully this will be extra relevant for all of us this week. All right, first things first. Uh, the idea of family is very rich. Historically, it has meant a lot of different things, but typically, it's been rooted in the idea that everyone involved gets mutual benefit, right? Um, it can be seen as a unit that's focused both on power and practicality. Power of numbers, right? The power of having a large family, right? Think of the early American history where you had families homesteading on the prairies, and it took a large family to run the farm. Right? You could think of all the different children serving a different role on the farm. Right? Since farming culture has sort of gone away in America, you can see families have gotten a lot smaller. There hasn't been a lot of need for it. Right? It's not very practical to have a large family because it's a lot of mouths to feed. But 150, 200 years ago was very practical because you needed all those hands on deck to help with things like feeding the chickens and harvesting the crops. And whereas now we just family to take care of the house. And when I was a kid, my sister and I, we had chores around the house, right? 200 years ago, our chores would have been pretty different, and probably would have been helpful to have more family members, right? But families have typically been all about having more power of numbers, and practicality, helping each other out, right? To have a group of people that are united by blood was very practical, right? You had a group of people always there to help you. What's interesting, though, is historically the word family is based on the Latin word famulus. And famulus is a Latin word for servant or slave, right? So in the early days, perhaps definitely more than today, family was seen as serving or enslaved to one another. Or the way I think of it, it probably meant was that children were enslaved to their parents. And definitely in the days of family farms, I think that was maybe more true, that you were a servant to your family, right? Your job was to make sure you took care of the family farm. Today, that's not so much the case, right? I know for a lot of families today, it seems like maybe the parents are slaves to the children, right? Trying to keep their children happy, making sure their children get everything they need. Right? So things have sort of switched on us, I would say. But I don't think anybody really is enslaved anymore. And I believe at one point, being a child in many a family was like being a slave, right? You did what you were told, and you didn't really have any power, right? The idea of don't speak unless spoken to, right? And we still have vestiges of that idea in our culture today, but nowhere near what it used to mean. But still, I think it's telling to think of the idea that the root for family is slave. All right, moving on. Today we've got really a couple basic definitions for family. The first one from our textbook says it's a system with two or more interdependent people who have a common history and a present reality, and who expect to influence each other in the future. All right, great definition, I think, right? People that depend on one another, right? They share a past and they share a present, right? And they expect to have an influence over one another into the future, right? That covers an awful lot, right? A lot of different groups could be considered families in this way. Okay. Now the key here is interdependence, and I imagine how much you look at interdependence would impact whether or not it's truly a family, right? People that work together are interdependent of each other, right, to some degree, but they don't depend on each other for food. They don't depend on each other for shelter. They depend on each other for other things. So I think with extreme degrees of interdependence, that's when you start to have what we would consider a family. And you can think of certain communes as being like families, right? Because they typically treat each other like what we think of as the standard family would treat each other. Right? They take good care of each other and make sure that everyone's fed and sheltered. Okay. Another definition is that a family is a group of people who create and maintain a mutual identity. They have emotional bonds and communication boundaries through how they interact with each other and others. They share a common past, present, and future, and who may or may not share biological heritage. All right, I think this definition is even better, although it's a lot more complex. It still has that component of sharing a common past, present, and future, but it adds the idea that it's a group of people that create and maintain an identity, emotional bonds, and communication boundaries through their communication. Okay? And that, I think, allows us to really explore the idea of family even better. And finally, the authors of this definition say that biological heritage is not required. They may or they may not share biological heritage. Okay? So people can define themselves as a family, and they're a family, right? They don't need to have blood or genetic relations. Okay, now qualities of families. These are things that we can say, this is what a family has, right? Going beyond the definition. First things first, they create a sense of family identity, all right? So through their communication, there's a sense that they're a family. Right? They know who they are, right? Whether they're, as I used the example of a commune earlier, or a kibbutz in Israel, right? If they speak of themselves as a family, they're a family, right? It's all about communication. Secondly, the family bonds are emotionally intense because typically, for all of us, we are all children at some point, right? And the bonds we form as children are very strong. Some of us still have those connections that we had with the adults in our life from when we were children. Some of us don't for various reasons, right? But those bonds that we form as children tend to be very intense, right? We're very impressionable at that young age, and we're also very needy, right, of other people to take care of us. So we develop very strong bonds. So that's very typical of families. Families also use interpersonal communication to define boundaries, right? Not only do they define boundaries inside the family unit, but they also define boundaries outside of. So you know who is not a member of the family, right? And who you can talk with, what you can talk about, right? Both inside and outside the family. That's a very common quality of families, right? You might have somebody, there might be an aunt or an uncle who you never talk about a certain thing with, right? Politically, you just differ, so you just don't talk to each other about this issue, right? Or you do, but when you do talk about it, you talk about it in a certain way, right? So you have boundaries. All right, families also share a history, and this history is maintained and created. Again, there's just the idea of we're creating reality through the narratives we tell each other, such as how parents met, or a big event that happened when you were in the fifth grade, right? There are common stories that get told and retold in families, and that helps maintain the sense of identity and helps create it. Right? A big one is, another big one is, what happened when you were born? What was your dad doing? What was your how was the labor for your mom, etc. And finally, family members often share genetic material, right? So you don't have to, but people do. And not so much popular anymore with HIV, right, and other bloodborne viruses. But when I was a kid, it was really common for people that were really close to each other to, cut their thumbs and then exchange their blood, right? Called it blood brothers or blood sisters, right? So that's going back to the idea that people that share genetic material are family, right? People that were explicitly using that to create family together. All right, moving on. Sort of the focus here, and really big issue in family communication is this idea of communication rules or patterns, right? Boundaries are a part of that, for example. Right? But each family has beliefs about how a family should communicate and how that family should interact with one another. All right. These patterns arise from two sets of beliefs regarding conversation orientation and conformity orientation. We'll get more into those in a second. And this pattern that results from this, and how they deal with the conversation conformity orientations, results in a culture that is unique for each family. So every family has its own culture. You may never have thought about that before, but if you step back and look at your own family, you probably realize you do. There's a way that your family interacts and exists. And when you go, I remember when I was a kid, my family was really open and kind of, we were pretty silly, I would say, in the way we interacted, and we had a lot of fun together. And I'd go to other families' houses for dinner, and it was a totally different culture, right? Everybody waited to speak until the father had spoken, for example. The conversation was really limited in terms of what you could talk about. It was really serious. One person talked at a time. Different cultures. And I think, for example, that's a really good example to see it. Another place you can see family culture coming out is in maybe a family trip. Right? How your family functions on a family trip. Does everybody do everything together? Do people break up and do their own thing? How do things work? All right, so let's look more closely then at one of these ideas. First, conversation orientation. Right? And here the definition is it is the degree of fluidity, right? How flexible it is, the degree of fluidity with which family members converse, and the range of topics that they discuss. Right? So how open is it? All right. High conversation orientation families, they see communication as the principal vehicle for maintaining family bonds. Right? That's how they do it. So they're obviously going to talk a lot. Right? What do they talk about? Everything. Right? Their innermost thoughts, and they debate ideas. Right? Their idea of positive conflict is pretty common in these types of families that have a high conversation orientation. Right? And one thing that's also very common here is that families with high conversation orientation tend to establish rituals where they can perform this type of behavior. Right? They either have a nightly meal, or there's a check-in. When you come home from school, you check in with your parents. Or when you first see your grandparents, you're supposed to sit down and chat with them for a little while. Right? A really common ritual is a weekly meal. I know my family we just reinstituted actually the Sunday night meal, right? And every night on Sunday, no matter what you're doing, you better get your butt home at a certain time so that you can be there to have dinner with everybody. And it was typically a nice dinner, and everybody hung out and talked and just sort of touched base for the week. Right? And I would say that my family has an extremely high conversation orientation, right? Now, the other side of the spectrum is low conversation orientation. And here families see interpersonal communication as being irrelevant to and unnecessary for a satisfying and successful family life. Right? A happy family is not based on totally open conversation. Right? Certain things are talked about, certain things are not talked about. In a very low conversation orientation family, very little is talked about. Right? It might just be small talk and the weather. Right? But you still know you care about each other. But certain things just aren't discussed. Right? They're off the table. Right? And these families don't believe you need to communicate to have closeness and a successful family life together. The other orientation is conformity orientation. And this refers to the degree to which families use communication to emphasize similarity or diversity in their attitudes, beliefs, and values. Right? So a family that's on the high end of conformity orientation, these families highlight and enforce conformity of thought in their communication. Right? So the way people talk enforces conformity. Right? So your parents might ask you why you're wearing that to school, or I can't believe you would do that, or when you talk, there's a sense of you're breaking from the norms of our family. Right? So there's this idea that there are certain things that are acceptable and there are other things that are not. And through the communication of family, a high conformity orientation family will ensure that you know where you're supposed to be. And there's constant reminding of where you're supposed to be. And some of you might have a high conformity orientation family, but not conform, right? And then you suffer consequences from that probably. You may not be as close as you would like, right? Or you're in a high conformity orientation family and you toe the line and you do what your family expects of you, and you're very close with them, right? And ideally, what you're conforming to is something that you agree with, right? That it's not forced. The other end of the spectrum, you've got low conformity orientation, and these families communicate in ways that emphasize diversity in attitudes, beliefs, and values. They encourage members' uniqueness, independence, and individuality, right? So here, the way people communicate, it's not about making sure everybody's on the same page, everyone believes the same thing. It's an openness, right? Family unity is not, in these types of families, is not a measure of how similar everybody is. It's how open everybody is to everybody else, right? So different strokes for different folks, right? You can see that two totally different types of cultures, but you can see they could be two totally happily united families. All right, so continuing from that, Scholars said, well, we can say you get 4 different types of families that result from this. And there's probably some overlap in reality. But so a consensual family, for example, is going to be on the high end of both orientations, both conversation and conformity, right? Pluralistic family, they're going to be high in conversation but low in conformity, right? So they talk about everything and you can do whatever you want, or whatever you do is accepted, right? And these families actually report the highest rate of conflict resolution among these 4 types. So when a conflict comes up, it gets worked through in the most beneficial manner, right? You can imagine in a consensual family, if it was very high conformity, certain things wouldn't be talked about, right? You just sort of put away your disagreements because you're not supposed to talk about certain things, right? In a pluralistic family, you're high in conversation, you talk about everything, and you don't have to be in agreement. A protective family is one that's low in conversation and high in conformity orientation, so they don't talk about very much. There's not a lot on the table that they talk about, and they expect pretty consistent behavior from everybody, right? And then you have a laissez-faire family, which is low in both. It's low in conversation and in conformity, right? So here, there's not a lot of conversation, and when there is conversation, it's pretty open. You can do whatever you want. There's no real evaluation or forcing you to try to be one way or another, right? So hopefully you can see where you land in some way here. And you might say, oh, I'm a little bit pluralistic, but sometimes we're more protective, right? So this isn't going to be a black and white issue where everyone fits into one, but it's helpful, and it gives us a place to start and a place to have a conversation that's more intellectual than just saying, I've got a fun family. What's yours like? You know? Okay, lastly, really important here is the idea of maintaining healthy family relationships. Right? The textbook talks about it and provides 4 different areas, such as striving for closeness while respecting boundaries, and a few others. But some other ways of looking at it, here are 3. The idea of being positive, open, and giving assurances. Right? Really great way and easy way to maintain a positive, healthy family relationship is to communicate in an upbeat and hopeful fashion. Right? When you talk with people in your family, if you're positive, boom, you tend to have stronger bonds. Right? You tend to have a healthier relationship. People don't often do this because we're basically, everyone's in our families, they're stuck with us, so we can treat them how we want. Right? If you're nasty to your friends, like some of us are to some of our family members, your friend's probably going to disappear. But a lot of us don't worry about that with our family. And for some of us, it's like, oh, cool, I can keep treating them that way. Others say, gosh, they're stuck with me. I might as well make the best of it still. All right, so besides positivity, we've got openness. And openness means behaving toward family members in ways that are consistent, trustworthy, and ethical. Right? You're not hiding from them. You're not being inconsistent. You're not being deceitful. You're being yourself, and you're being straightforward. Right? So that's a really good way to maintain healthy family relationships. I know sometimes people that are open and with their family members can sometimes get into some trouble. Maybe they crossed a boundary. You know, you told your mom or your dad or your aunt or your uncle or somebody something that they weren't comfortable hearing, and they sort of shut down on you. But in the long run, that sort of communication tends to result in a positive, healthy family relationship. And lastly, something that a lot of us, I think, take for granted, and we don't do enough of, is giving one another assurances. Right? Regularly telling our family members how much the relationship means to them and how much the family means to them. Right? And I myself, since doing work in interpersonal communication, I've worked on this one, and it's cool. I mean, you don't really realize how little the people outside of your brain, how little they know about your feelings. So personally, I started sharing my feelings a lot more, telling people how much they mean to me, and really creating through communication stronger bonds and stronger family networks, even with my friends who I consider like family. Right? So assurances, openness, and positivity, all of these can go a really long way to making any kind of family stronger. All right, that's it for this week. Hope you have a good one, and take care.